The silence in the royal chambers had become a living thing, a pressure against the eardrums that was heavier than any sound. For 5 years, it had been King Lucian's most constant companion, a smothering blanket woven from dread and resignation. He sat in a high-backed chair carved from obsidian and upholstered in blood-red velvet, the fabric worn thin where his restless hands had worried it. Before him, a vast arched window framed a sky the color of a bruised plum, the last light of day bleeding away into the encroaching twilight. Once, he would have welcomed the night, felt its cool energy seeping into his very bones, a thrilling symphony only he could hear. Now, it was just a deeper shade of grey, another turn of the hourglass measuring out his inexplicable decline. His body, once a vessel of immortal strength that could shatter stone and outlast empires, felt like a cage of brittle glass. A deep, cellular weariness had settled into his marrow, a lethargy so profound that lifting his hand to the goblet of wine on the table beside him was a monumental effort. The wine, dark and rich, remained untouched. It tasted of ash in his mouth these days, like everything else. He could feel the web of his own power, the ancient life force that defined him, fraying thread by thread. The court physicians, a succession of worried men with soft hands and useless theories, had come and gone. They had bled him with silver leeches, prescribed tinctures of moonpetal and sundrake scales, and chanted incantations in forgotten tongues. Nothing had worked. The weakness persisted, a slow, relentless tide pulling him under. He had retreated from the world, first from the council meetings, then from the public courts, and finally, from the castle itself. Now, these chambers were his entire kingdom. The court whispered. They called him the waning king, the shadow on the throne. He knew they did. He could feel the shift in the castle's atmosphere, the power vacuum he had left beginning to draw in the ambitious and the predatory. His most trusted advisor, Lord Valerus, managed the affairs of state, his face a perfect mask of loyal concern during his daily reports. But even Valerus's eyes, Lucian had noticed, sometimes held a flicker of something else, pity, or perhaps, appraisal. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. It was too gentle for a guard, too hesitant for Valerus. "Enter," he commanded, his voice a dry rasp, a pale echo of the resonant baritone that had once commanded armies. The door opened, and a young woman stepped inside. She was new. He saw that immediately. The previous maid, a woman whose face he could barely recall, had been dismissed for carelessness a week ago. This one was slight of build, with dark, serious eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She curtsied, her movements efficient and quiet. "Your Majesty. I am Diana. I've come to turn down the bed." He gave a faint, dismissive wave of his hand. "Do as you must." He turned his gaze back to the window, to the first stars pricking the velvet dark. He preferred to be alone, but the small routines of the household were one of the few things that still tethered him to the world of the living. He listened to the soft rustle of her skirts, the whisper of fresh linen being unfolded. The sounds were unobtrusive, a quiet counterpoint to the roaring silence in his own head. He had ceased to truly see the servants years ago. They were ghosts, moving through the periphery of his fading existence, their faces and names blurring into a meaningless succession. But there was something about the quality of this new maid's silence that was different. It was not the fearful silence of a servant in the presence of a formidable king, nor the awkward silence of someone unsure of their place. It was an observant silence. He could feel her gaze on him, not with impertinence, but with a kind of focused curiosity. When he finally turned his head, he saw her standing by the grand four-poster bed, a linen sheet held in her hands. She was not looking at him, but at the pillowcase she had just removed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Is there a problem?" he asked, the words costing him more effort than they should. She started, as if pulled from a trance, and her cheeks flushed. "No, Your Majesty. Forgive me. It is nothing." She quickly bundled the old linens, her movements suddenly flustered. But he had seen it, the brief, unguarded moment of intense scrutiny. For the first time in a long, long time, Lucian felt a flicker of something other than exhaustion. It was a faint, unfamiliar spark of curiosity. He watched as she finished her work, moving with a grace that was almost soundless, a shadow in the deepening gloom of his chambers. When she left, the room felt emptier than before, the silence she left behind somehow heavier, more profound. He looked at his bed, at the pristine white pillows, and wondered what she had seen. Diana's hands were steady as she stripped the king's bed, but her mind was a whirlwind. It had been her third day in the royal chambers, a position she'd earned through years of diligent, invisible work in the lower echelons of the castle staff. The heart of the kingdom, they called this place. To her, it felt more like a tomb. A beautiful, gilded tomb, but a tomb nonetheless. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, beeswax, and something else, something metallic and faintly bitter that she couldn't place. She had heard the stories of King Lucian, of course. Every child in the kingdom grew up with them. Lucian the Undying, the Nightstone King, who had ruled for 5 centuries with unyielding strength and wisdom. The legends painted him as a figure of breathtaking power, a man whose presence could still a riot and whose gaze could see into the hearts of men. The man she served was a ghost. He was tall, yes, and the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face still held a severe beauty, but it was a beauty etched with a profound, bone-deep weariness. His eyes, which were said to burn like embers, were shadowed and dull. He moved with the careful fragility of an old man, his great hands trembling slightly as they rested on the arms of his chair. It was the dust that had first caught her attention. On the first day, she had thought it was merely dust, a fine, silvery powder that clung to the deep blue velvet of the bed's headboard. She had wiped it away meticulously. But the next day, it was back, concentrated on the pillows and the upper sheets, exactly where the king's head and shoulders would rest. And it was not dust. Dust was grey or brown, soft and feathery. This was heavier, with a strange, almost greasy texture that left a faint shimmer on her cleaning cloth. It had a faint, sharp scent, like ozone after a lightning strike. Today, she saw it again, a faint, almost imperceptible glittering on the discarded pillowcase. But it was more than that. As she turned to face the king, she had seen the same faint shimmer in the dark waves of his hair and, more concentrated, along the inner band of the crown that rested on a velvet cushion by his bedside table. It was a simple circlet of blackened steel he wore in the privacy of his chambers, not the grand, jewel-encrusted crown of state. And it was coated with the stuff. The realization had struck her with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't dust or dirt. It was being placed there. Deliberately. Now, in the relative safety of the castle laundry, a vast, steam-filled chamber deep in the bowels of the fortress, Diana spread the king's pillowcase on a wooden table. The other laundry maids chattered around her, their voices a comfortable drone of gossip and complaints. Diana ignored them. Under the flickering gaslight, the silvery powder was more visible. She touched it tentatively with the tip of her finger. It felt cool, almost unnervingly so. She thought back to her father, an alchemist's assistant who had filled her childhood with talk of metals and their properties. He had spoken of silver, of its purity, its resistance to corruption. But he had also spoken of its other, more secret nature in folklore, a bane to creatures of the night, a poison to those of immortal blood. A cold dread trickled down her spine. The king was immortal. The king was weakening. And every night, he laid his head down on a pillow laced with a strange silver powder that also coated the inside of his crown. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, simple logic. It was not a sickness. It was an assassination. A slow, patient, and utterly monstrous one, carried out over years, right under the noses of the entire royal court. Someone was murdering the king, one glittering grain of dust at a time. Her breath caught in her throat. What was she to do? She was a maid. A nobody. Her word against whose? Whoever was doing this was powerful, trusted enough to gain access to the king's private chambers, to his very bed, his crown. To speak of this would be to sign her own death warrant. They would call her a madwoman, a conspirator. They would silence her, and the poison would continue its silent, deadly work. She could quit. She could ask for a new assignment, pretend she had seen nothing. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. She could live out her life in quiet obscurity. She looked down at her hands, at the faint silver shimmer on her fingertip. She thought of the king's face, the profound loneliness in his shadowed eyes. He was not a monster from a legend, he was a man, trapped and dying, and no one else could see the cage. Everyone bustled around him, wringing their hands and offering useless potions, while the weapon itself was literally under their noses, dismissed as dust. They saw what they expected to see, a king succumbing to a mysterious ailment. She had seen what was actually there. And in that moment, Diana knew that she could not walk away. The risk was enormous, a chasm of fear that threatened to swallow her whole. But the thought of leaving him to fade away in that silent, lonely room was a greater terror. Her father had taught her that truth, no matter how small or inconvenient, had a weight of its own. And this truth was heavy enough to crush a kingdom. She had to tell him. She had to find a way. For 2 more days, Diana moved in a state of heightened, terrified awareness. Every shadow in the castle corridors seemed to conceal a threat, every sideways glance from a guard or a fellow servant felt like a judgment. She performed her duties in the king's chambers with a quiet, trembling precision, her eyes darting everywhere, cataloguing every detail. She confirmed her suspicions. The dust was reapplied daily, a fresh, faint layer she would find each afternoon. It was most concentrated on the items he touched most intimately: his pillow, the inside of his nightshirt collar, the leather-bound book he kept by his bed, and always, the inner band of his crown. The application was masterful, almost invisible unless one was specifically looking for it. The question of who gnawed at her. Only a handful of people had unrestricted access to these rooms. The chamberlain, who oversaw the household staff. The captain of the royal guard, who posted the sentries outside his door. And Lord Valerius, his advisor, who spent at least an hour with the king each morning, delivering his reports. Diana watched them all from the corner of her eye. The chamberlain was a fussy, nervous man, more concerned with folded linens than with regicide. The captain was a grim, stoic soldier, his loyalty to the king legendary. But Valerius was smooth, his demeanor a polished veneer of solicitous concern. He would often linger after the king had dismissed him, adjusting a tapestry or straightening a book, his movements unhurried and proprietary. He had the access, the intelligence, and the opportunity. On the 3rd day, she made her decision. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve had hardened over it like a shell. She waited until late in the evening, after the castle had settled into its nocturnal rhythm. The king was in his usual chair by the window, a silhouette against the moonlit sky. He looked even more tired than usual, his head bowed as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much to bear. Diana approached him, not with her usual servant's deference, but with a quiet, determined purpose. She curtsied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He did not turn. "What is it?" "I must beg a private audience. On a matter of the gravest importance." This earned her a slow turn of his head. In the dim light, his eyes seemed like dark, hollow pools. "Grave importance? Child, the world is filled with matters of grave importance. None of them trouble me here." There was a profound bitterness in his tone, the sound of a man who had already surrendered. "This matter concerns your health, sire." A dry, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "My health? Has the kitchen maid now decided to try her hand at diagnostics where the Royal College of Physicians has failed? Tell me, do you have a poultice of goose fat and hope for me?" His scorn stung, but it also solidified her nerve. He was pushing her away because he had forgotten what it was like for anyone to truly try to help. "No, Your Majesty," she said, her voice firmer now. She took a step closer, holding out a small, folded piece of dark blue velvet, a swatch she had cut from a discarded cushion cover. "I have this." He stared at the cloth, then at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "And what is that supposed to be?" "It is evidence, sire." She unfolded it carefully. In the center of the dark velvet, she had gathered a small, concentrated pile of the silvery dust, collected over the past 3 days. It glittered under the moonlight streaming through the window, an unnatural constellation of poison. "I found this on your pillowcase. And on your sheets. And in your hair. And," she took a deep breath, steeling herself, "on the inside of your crown." Lucian stared at the glittering powder. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, thin and taut. He finally pushed himself up from his chair, a slow, arduous movement. He walked towards her, his steps unsteady. He was close enough now that she could see the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the faint, almost invisible shimmer of the same dust at his temples. He reached out a trembling hand, not to take the cloth, but to hover his fingertips over the powder, as if sensing its nature through proximity alone. Silver, he breathed, the word a ghost of a sound. A wave of something, recognition, horror, understanding, washed over his features. The dullness in his eyes was replaced by a sudden, sharp light. He looked from the powder to her, and for the first time, he was truly seeing her, Diana, not just a nameless maid. 5 years, he whispered, his voice cracking with the enormity of the realization. 5 years, they have told me it was a wasting sickness. A curse. A blight upon my blood. He stumbled back and snatched the simple steel circlet from its cushion. He ran his thumb along the inside. It came away with a faint, silvery sheen. The truth, stark and terrible, stood revealed in the quiet of the room. He was not fading. He was being unmade. Who? He demanded, his voice suddenly raw with a power she had not heard before. It was the king's voice, buried but not yet dead. I do not know for certain, Your Majesty, Diana said, her own voice trembling in the charged atmosphere. But the poison is reapplied daily. Freshly. It can only be someone with routine, unquestioned access to these chambers. Someone you trust. Lucian's eyes locked onto hers. The last 5 years of confusion, of creeping despair and slow decay, had just been recast in a new and terrible light. It was not a failing of his body. It was a betrayal of the highest order. The lethargy that had held him captive for so long began to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear fire of rage. He looked at the young woman before him, this quiet, observant maid who had seen the truth that all his advisors, guards, and physicians had missed. She had handed him a weapon, the most powerful weapon of all, the truth. And in his eyes, she was no longer a servant. She was an ally. The only one he had. They have made a grave error, Lucian said, his voice low and resonant, the rust of disuse falling away to reveal the steel beneath. They thought me a dying animal. They have forgotten that even a dying wolf still has teeth. The king's chambers, once a place of stagnant despair, became a silent war room. Over the next 2 days, a strange and potent alliance formed between the fading monarch and the quiet maid. Lucian, buoyed by the cold fury of betrayal, found a reserve of strength he thought long gone. It was a pale shadow of his former power, but it was enough. The fog of lethargy had been replaced by a razor-sharp focus. He was weak in body, but his mind, a mind that had navigated the treacherous currents of 5 centuries of politics, was now fully awake and honed by a singular purpose, to unmask his would-be assassin. Diana became his eyes and ears. She moved through the castle, performing her duties, her expression placid and unremarkable, but her senses were on fire. She watched, she listened. She reported back to him every evening in hushed tones, describing the movements of the key suspects, the casual words exchanged in corridors, the subtle shifts in the court's atmosphere. She told him how Lord Valerus's personal guard had been quietly doubled, how he had been seen in late-night conversation with the master of the treasury. Small things, circumstantial things, but together they began to weave a tapestry of conspiracy. He is preparing, Lucian murmured one evening, as he studied a map of the castle Diana had procured for him. He believes my end is near. He is consolidating power for the transition. He tapped a finger on the map, indicating the royal vault. He needs resources to buy the loyalty of the army. Their plan was simple, elegant in its audacity. It relied on their enemy's arrogance, on his belief that his victim was too weak and too blind to fight back. Lucian would summon a small, private council meeting in his chambers, a rare occurrence that would not seem overly suspicious. He would claim he wished to amend his will, a final act of a dying king. The chamberlain, the captain of the guard, and Lord Valerus would be required to attend as witnesses. He will not be able to resist, Lucian explained, his eyes glittering with a cold fire. The chance to be present at my final capitulation? To see his victory formalized. His vanity will demand it. On the day of the council, Diana helped Lucian dress. It was an intimate, somber ritual. Instead of his usual simple tunic, He chose a formal doublet of black silk, embroidered with the silver thread of his house sigil. The effort of dressing left him pale and short of breath, a stark reminder of his physical vulnerability. The final piece was his crown. Not the poisoned steel circlet that was now hidden away, a piece of evidence, but a heavier, ceremonial crown of silver and onyx that he had not worn in years. "It is heavy," Diana said softly, as she placed it on his head. "Let him see it," Lucian replied, his voice grim. "Let him see the weight he so desperately covets." He looked at his reflection in a polished silver mirror. The crown seemed to mock the gaunt, tired man who wore it. "Diana," he said, his gaze meeting hers in the reflection. "When the moment comes, you will stand by the tapestries near the east wall. There is a service passage behind it. If this goes awry, you will flee. Do you understand me? You will not be a casualty in this." Diana's heart clenched. She saw the fierce, protective light in his eyes, the unspoken acknowledgement of the debt he owed her and the danger he had placed her in. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said, though the thought of abandoning him was a physical pain. As the appointed hour approached, the tension in the room became a palpable force. Lucian sat not in his usual chair of retreat, but upon the throne-like seat at the head of a long mahogany table, a position he had not taken in years. He looked regal and terribly frail. Diana took her position, melting into the shadows by the heavy tapestry, her hands hidden in the folds of her apron, clutching a small, heavy silver letter opener she had taken from the king's desk. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. First came the chamberlain, wringing his hands. Then the captain of the guard, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Finally, Lord Valerus entered. He was impeccably dressed in dark, rich fabrics, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He moved with an easy, confident grace, his face a study in sorrowful duty. "Your Majesty," Valerus said, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "You honor us with this summons, though it grieves me to see the effort it costs you." "There are matters that cannot wait, Valerus," Lucian said, his voice carefully weak. "Even for death." The council began. Lucian spoke of his intentions to ensure a smooth succession, of his faith in the council to guide the kingdom. Valerus listened, his expression attentive, his posture relaxed. He believed he was watching the final act of a play he had written himself. Diana watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. She saw the slight, self-satisfied curve of his lips, the possessive way his gaze swept the room. He was already measuring for new curtains. Then, Lucian paused. He lifted a hand and gestured to a simple wooden box on the table before him. "Before we sign these amendments, there is one final gift I wish to bestow. A reward for loyalty." Valerus inclined his head. "Your Majesty is too generous." "Am I?" Lucian's voice changed. The feigned weakness fell away, and a chilling power bled into his tone. "I think not. For 5 years, I have received a gift every single day. A most intimate, personal gift. It is only fitting I should return the favor." He opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the blackened steel crown, its inner band glowing faintly in the candlelight. Beside it lay the dark blue cloth Diana had shown him, the silver dust piled in its center like a heap of crushed stars. A deafening silence fell over the room. The chamberlain stared in confusion. The captain's eyes widened, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. But Valerus went perfectly still. The mask of concern did not just crack, it shattered. His face went pale, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure, venomous hatred. He had been so close. "A curious gift, sire," Valerus said, his voice losing its silken edge, becoming hard and sharp as glass. "It is the gift of knowledge, my lord," Lucian countered, his voice ringing with newfound strength. "The knowledge that I see you. That I know what you have done." He stood up, a movement that was no longer frail but filled with a terrible, gathering power. "You sought to poison me in darkness and silence. Now, you will answer for it in the light." The air crackled, the political maneuvering of the past are evaporating in an instant, replaced by the primal certainty of violence. Valerus did not bother with denials. His face twisted into a snarl of pure fury, the face of a predator whose prey had just turned and bared its fangs. You were supposed to be dead, he hissed, his voice a guttural rasp of disbelief and rage. With a speed that belied his courtly demeanor, he acted. He kicked the heavy mahogany table backwards, sending it crashing into the chamberlain and the captain, creating a momentary chaos of splintering wood and startled cries. In the same fluid motion, he drew a long, thin dagger from beneath his doublet. The blade was dark, coated in some viscous, black substance that seemed to drink the light. It was not a weapon for a fair fight, it was an assassin's tool. Lucian, still physically weak despite his surge of adrenaline, was a vulnerable target. He had anticipated a confession, a political collapse, not a frontal assault. He braced himself, his body screaming in protest, but he knew he was too slow. Valerus lunged, not at the king's heart, but at his throat, a killing blow meant to be swift and final. Diana saw the entire sequence in a series of nightmarishly clear, slow-motion tableaus: the overturned table, the captain's struggle to regain his footing, the glint of candlelight on the poisoned steel, the murderous intent in Valerus's eyes. She saw Lucian, proud and defiant but ultimately helpless. There was no time for thought, only a raw, primal instinct. She had not brought him back from the brink only to watch him be murdered before her eyes. With a cry that was torn from her throat, she threw herself forward, out of the shadows and into the space between the assassin and the king. She was not a warrior. She had no training. Her only weapon was her body. She slammed into Valerus's side, the impact jarring, throwing his lunge off course. The dagger, intended for Lucian's neck, was diverted. Diana felt a searing, white-hot line of pain slice across her ribs. It was sharp and shockingly deep. For a moment, she felt nothing but a stunned surprise, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She looked down and saw the dark gash in her dress, the blood welling up, impossibly dark. The blade had been for him. And it had found her instead. The pain, when it came a second later, was all-consuming. It was not just the pain of the cut, but a venomous, icy cold that began to spread through her veins, stealing the warmth from her limbs, the air from her lungs. She stumbled back, her knees buckling, a gasp escaping her lips. The silver letter opener fell from her numb fingers, clattering uselessly on the stone floor. Lucian watched her fall. He saw the shock on her face, the bloom of red on her simple grey dress. He saw the life beginning to drain from her eyes. And something inside him, something that had been dormant for a century, broke free. A roar of pure, untempered fury ripped through the room, a sound that was not entirely human. It was the sound of a predator, a king, a god of the night witnessing the one pure thing in his world being extinguished. The weakness, the 5 years of creeping death, the cellular exhaustion, it was all burned away in a white-hot inferno of protective rage. Power, true power, flooded his system. It was a torrent, a tidal wave of ancient life force that slammed into every cell of his being. His vision sharpened, the room snapping into hyperfocus. The flickering candlelight became a steady, brilliant glow. He could hear the frantic beat of the chamberlain's heart, the grinding of the captain's teeth, the whisper of air over Valerus's blade. The world slowed down, stretching out before him. Valerus, momentarily surprised by Diana's intervention, turned back to his primary target, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw Lucian standing there, no longer gaunt and frail, but radiating an aura of palpable menace. The king's eyes were no longer shadowed pools, they were blazing furnaces. Impossible, Valerus stammered, taking an involuntary step back. You took her from me, Lucian snarled, his voice a low, guttural thunder. He moved. He did not walk or run, he flowed across the space between them, a blur of black silk and incandescent rage. The fight, if it could be called that, was over before it began. Valerus raised his dagger, a desperate, reflexive defense. Lucian's hand shot out, impossibly fast, and caught his wrist. The sound of bones crunching echoed in the silent room. Valerus screamed, a thin, reedy sound that was cut short as Lucian's other hand closed around his throat. He lifted the advisor off the floor with one arm, the man's feet kicking uselessly in the air. You thought to unmake a king, Lucian hissed, his face inches from the traitors. You, a gnat, buzzing around a lion's ear. You poisoned my body, but you have poisoned my kingdom with your ambition. And you have dared to harm her." There was no mercy in his eyes, only a cold, absolute finality. With a final, contemptuous twist, he ended it. The body of Lord Valerus dropped to the floor like a discarded puppet, his face frozen in a mask of terror and surprise. The room was utterly still, save for the ragged, heaving breaths of the king. The captain of the guard and the chamberlain stared, mouths agape, at the terrifying, awe-inspiring display of power they had just witnessed. The waning king was gone. In his place stood the stuff of legends, a being of terrible and beautiful wrath. But the rage subsided as quickly as it had come, extinguished by a more powerful, more terrifying emotion: fear. Lucian's head snapped towards Diana. She lay crumpled on the floor, her breathing shallow, her skin taking on a deathly pallor. The icy poison was doing its work. He was at her side in an instant, gathering her into his arms. She was so light, so fragile. Her eyes fluttered open, trying to focus on his face. "Your Majesty," she whispered, a trickle of blood at the corner of her lips. "Hush, Diana. Save your strength," he commanded, his voice thick with a desperation he had not felt in centuries. He pressed a hand to her side, but he could feel the life draining out of her, the cold spreading like a stain. The physicians would be useless. The poison was too fast, too potent. He could feel her dying in his arms. A terrible choice presented itself, a crossroads in the heart of his grief. He could let her die. He could let her slip away, a mortal hero who had saved her king, and mourn her for the rest of his long, lonely existence. It would be the kindest thing to do, to allow her a natural end, a peaceful rest. But the thought of a world without her in it, without her quiet strength, her observant eyes, the courage that had shamed an entire court, it was an agony he could not bear. The silence of his chambers had been a pressure, but a world without her would be a true void, an eternity of empty rooms. He would not lose her. He could not. He looked down at her face, so pale in the candlelight. He had one gift to give, one terrible, irreversible gift. It was a curse and a sacrament, a damnation and a salvation. It was the only thing he had that could conquer the poison that was stealing her from him. "Forgive me," he whispered, to her, and perhaps to whatever gods might be listening. He lowered his head, his fangs, unused for so long, extending with a sharp, painful ache. He bit into his own wrist, tearing through skin and vein. Dark, immortal blood, now singing with renewed power, welled up from the wound. He pressed his bleeding wrist to her lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a raw plea. "Diana, drink. Live." At first, she was too weak to respond. Her lips were cold. But a drop of his blood touched her tongue, and a faint tremor ran through her body. Her eyes widened slightly. Instinct, ancient and powerful, took over where consciousness had failed. Her lips parted, and she began to drink, a weak, desperate suckling at the fount of his life. He held her close, cradling her head, feeling the transfer of power, of life, of eternity itself. He felt her failing heartbeat begin to steady, to strengthen, to change its rhythm into something new, something that echoed the ancient, powerful cadence of his own. The cold in her veins was being fought back, burned away by the potent fire of his immortal blood. He watched as the color began to return to her cheeks, as the shallow breaths deepened, as the light of life, a new and different kind of life, rekindled in her eyes. The transformation had begun. He had saved her. And he had damned her. And in the terrible, beautiful, selfish calculus of his heart, he knew he would do it again without a moment's hesitation. The world returned to Diana not in a gentle wave, but as a crashing, overwhelming symphony of sensation. The first thing she felt was power, a clean, vibrant energy humming in her veins where the icy poison had been only moments before. The searing pain in her side was gone, replaced by a faint, tingling memory of the wound, which was already knitting itself closed. She could feel the individual threads in the king's silk doublet against her cheek, the faint coolness of the stone floor through her dress, the subtle currents of air stirring the dust motes in the room. Then came the sounds. The frantic, terrified thumping of the chamberlain's heart, a rapid, panicked drumbeat. The slower, steadier rhythm of the captain of the guard, a disciplined march. And closest of all, a deep, powerful, resonant beat that was both a sound and a feeling, a vibration that seemed to call to something deep within her. It was Lucian's heart. She could hear the blood moving through his veins, a quiet, eternal river. She opened her eyes. The world was achingly, breathtakingly clear. The flickering candlelight did not flicker. Each flame was a steady, perfect teardrop of gold, and she could see the swirling patterns of heat rising from each wick. The shadows in the corners of the room were not simply dark, they were alive with 1,000 shades of grey and black and indigo, each one rich and deep and full of detail. And then she saw him. He was holding her, his face just inches from hers. She saw not just the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face, but the almost invisible lines of care around his eyes, the dark, fathomless depth of his pupils, the way the light caught the faint trace of silver in his black hair. He was beautiful, with a stark, dangerous beauty that stole her breath away. And in his eyes, she saw a universe of emotions: relief, terror, hope, and a profound, wrenching guilt. "Diana," he whispered, his voice resonating through her entire being. She pushed herself up, her movements fluid and strong. She felt no weakness, no pain. She felt reborn. She touched her side, where the wound had been. There was nothing but smooth, unbroken skin. She looked at her hands. They seemed the same, yet different. Paler, perhaps, and imbued with a sense of coiled stillness, of latent strength. What did you do?" she asked, her own voice sounding strange to her ears, clearer, more melodic. "I saved you," he said simply, his voice heavy with the weight of that statement. "It was the only way." The poison was absolute. He held up his wrist. The wound he had given himself was already healing, closing into a thin white line. "My blood fights any poison. It heals any wound. But it changes." Diana understood. The stories, the legends, they weren't just tales for children. She could feel the truth of it humming inside her. The endless energy, the heightened senses, a new, deep-seated thirst that she hadn't noticed until this very moment, a thirst that seemed to recognize the scent of the blood still drying on her lips. She was like him now. Immortal. A creature of the night. She should have been horrified. She should have screamed, or wept, or recoiled from him. But as she looked at him, at the raw vulnerability on the face of this ancient, powerful king, she felt no fear. He had not done this to her as an act of power or possession. He had done it as an act of desperate, terrified love. He had shared his own eternity with her rather than face it alone. The captain of the guard finally found his voice. "Your Majesty, what is to be done?" he asked, his gaze flickering between the body of Valerus and the transformed Diana. Lucian did not take his eyes off her. "Leave us," he commanded, his voice once again filled with royal authority. "Clear this room. See to the traitor's body. Say nothing of what you have seen here. The official record will state that Lord Valerus attempted to assassinate his king and was slain for his treason. The maid, Diana, was gravely injured but will make a full recovery under my personal care. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the captain said, his voice filled with a new and profound awe. He and the trembling chamberlain bowed deeply and began the grim work of restoring order, moving with a quiet efficiency, their eyes carefully averted from the king and the woman in his arms. When they were finally alone, with the body of the traitor removed and the door securely shut, Lucian gently released her. He stood, creating a small distance between them, as if to give her space to fear him, to hate him. "I have condemned you, Diana," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its regal power, leaving only the sound of a man confessing his sins. "I have bound you to this long, lonely dark. I had no right. But the thought of losing you," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He looked so lost, so utterly alone in his own power. For 5 years, he had been a prisoner in his own palace, fading away in silence. And for 500 years before that, he had been a king, isolated by his own immortality. He had been surrounded by subjects, by servants, by sycophants, but he had been utterly alone. Until she had seen him. Really seen him. Not as a king, not as a legend, but as a man being slowly poisoned to death. She had seen the truth, and she had not been afraid to speak it. Diana slowly rose to her feet, feeling the new, effortless strength in her limbs. She walked towards him, closing the distance he had created. She reached out and placed a hand on his chest, right over his powerful, steady heart. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow. "You speak of condemnation," she said softly, her new voice holding a resonance that filled the quiet room. "But what I feel is not damnation. I feel awake." For the first time in my life she looked around the opulent chamber, which had once seemed so intimidating. Now, it was just a room. The true treasure in this place had never been the gold or the jewels. Lucian stared at her, his dark eyes wide with a fragile, dawning hope. He had expected terror, recriminations, hatred. He did not know how to respond to this quiet, profound acceptance. "For 5 years," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was surrounded by the most powerful people in the kingdom, and not one of them saw the truth that was right in front of them. They saw a failing king, and they waited for him to die. But you, a maid, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, you saw me. You saved my life by seeing what everyone else chose to ignore." He took her hand, his cool fingers lacing with hers. The contact sent a jolt of energy through them both, a shock of recognition, of belonging. "I will not have you as a servant in this court, Diana. I will not have you hiding in the shadows. Your place is not at my feet, but at my side." He swallowed, the words seeming to cost him more than any royal decree. "Stay with me. Not as my maid. Not as my ward. But as my queen." The offer hung in the air between them, shimmering with the weight of centuries. It was not a command. It was a plea. The undying king, the Nightstone monarch, was asking her, a servant girl, to share his throne, his life, his eternity. A slow smile spread across Diana's lips, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her face and made his heart ache with a joy he had thought he would never feel again. She had entered this castle seeking only a safe position, a way to earn her bread. She had stumbled into a nest of vipers, a dying king, and a plot that could have torn the kingdom apart. She had risked everything for a man she barely knew, driven by a simple, profound sense of justice. "When I came to this castle," she said, her voice clear and strong, "the other girls spoke of finding treasure, of catching the eye of a rich lord. But I found something better than treasure." She met his gaze, her own eyes, now impossibly clear and deep, holding his. "I found a king worth saving." A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over Lucian. He had offered her a crown, a kingdom, an eternity of power. And she had given him the one thing he truly craved, the knowledge that he was worthy. That he had been seen, and understood, and chosen. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of fealty that no one had ever seen him give. "Then let the world see what I see," he declared, his voice ringing with a power that was no longer born of rage, but of a fierce and boundless love. He gently guided her to stand beside him, turning them both to face the grand windows, where the first hint of dawn was beginning to pale the eastern sky. It no longer held any threat for either of them. It was just the end of a long night, and the promise of a new day.